Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today we are going to be talking about Herland and the Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and the discussion will be between me, Jo Brew, and Lierre Keith. And this series of webinars, Radical Feminist Perspectives, is run by radical feminists whose voices have been cancelled or silenced in universities, schools, and the media. We're frustrated we can't share what we know in these places, so we're offering this online series of webinars here. So welcome, Lierre, and your dog. And it's a real pleasure to talk about these two bits of writing by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. So the way we're gonna run this discussion is we're going to talk about the Yellow Wallpaper first, which Charlotte Perkins Gilman wrote in 1892, and then her book Herland, which she wrote in 1915. And Lierre's got those. But first of all, Lierre's going to tell us a bit about Charlotte Perkins Gilman. So over to you.
Yeah, so her father was Frederick Beecher Perkins. And if you're from the United States, you probably at least recognize the Beecher part of that name. He abandoned the family when she was just an infant. So she grew up in terrible poverty with a single mom. But the father had two aunts, Isabel Beecher Hooker, who was a suffragist, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, who very famously wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was the book that eventually started the Civil War. As an anti-slavery, a huge novel against slavery, which she was trying to present slavery in a way that sort of average people would be horrified by the facts of it. So she wrote a novel, which is honestly a good way to reach people in many circumstances, because they can identify with the characters and there's a plot, and it's not just reading dry facts. It's, you've got people that you can relate to and all this. So that was her attempt. And in fact, when she was later introduced to Abraham Lincoln, he said to her, the first thing he said to her was, "So you're the little woman who wrote the big book who started this war," because that's kind of what kicked it off. So, and she was only 4'10", so she was in fact a very little woman. Anyway, those were her aunts and the father's aunts. So she came from kind of a long line of people who were engaged in these movements, suffrage, socialism, abolition, labor movement. So that was sort of, her background, which she very willingly took up. But for most of her youth, it was interesting. She only was friends with boys, and she very happily called herself a quote tomboy, which I was not aware how far back that term went as a way to express a girl who was more athletic and more active. But that was what she called herself. So she was born in 1860. So they were, even at that point, they were using that word to describe the sort of, more quote masculine girls. But after she, achieved kind of college age, she was accepted at the Rhode Island School of Design as an artist. And that's one of the best art schools in America. So she was clearly quite good at art. And then very interestingly, she met this woman named Martha Luther, she was extremely close with for 4 years. I believe they even lived together. It's unclear whether they were actually lovers or whether this was quote a romantic friendship. But it was 4 of her happiest years, apparently. And then, sadly, Martha broke it off to marry a man. So that was that. Charlotte was devastated. And at that point, she said she detested romance. And so she was single for a while, but then she met her first husband. So she married him. He was an artist as well. His name was Charles Stetson, and that was in 1884. And then in 1885, she had her only child. And she was stricken with a severe postpartum psychosis, not even just depression. And so she had a very hard time after having that child. In 1888, she separated from him. And in 1894, she actually divorced him, which at the time was extremely rare. So that was obviously not a happy situation for her. And then she had another serious relationship with a woman, this woman named Adeline Knapp. And they lived together, and there's this great sentence about how she said that she told her friend that she could combine all the things that you might get with a man, except with this pure happiness of being with a woman. And So it sounded like that was really great, except suddenly it ended, and I'm not sure why. There's not enough detail about, her personal life, what actually happened there, but sadly, her heart was broken again. But then in 1990, she married her actual cousin, her first cousin. I guess that was a thing people used to do. He was an attorney named Houghton Gilman, and she did seem very happy in that marriage. So he died in 1934. So they were married 34 years. And then in 1935, she killed herself because she had cancer. So she euthanasiaed herself with chloroform rather than suffer, linger in a bad way. So she took it upon herself just to put an end to it. So she had a really illustrious career as an activist, the suffrage movement, socialism. She wrote all kinds of political tracts. And she was also a poet as well as an essayist. And she was an extremely successful lecturer. And for many years, she actually earned a living wandering the country. She was in high demand as a lecturer, speaking to all these causes. The Yellow Wallpaper essentially happened to her. That's why she wrote it. She was an actual patient of S. Weir Mitchell, who was the man who very, very famously or infamously came up with the quote rest cure. So that was inflicted upon her. And the rest cure was you would be told by your doctor, if you were a woman who had any kind of emotional problems, to do nothing, to lie in bed. You were forbidden from any reading materials, any writing materials, any art materials. You weren't even supposed to see anybody. None of your friends were allowed to come over. You couldn't go anywhere, and you would essentially be held imprisoned in your room to lie down all day. And so they tried this with her. She did it for 3 months, and she said she nearly went insane. And that was why she wrote that book, because that's pretty much what happened to her. And when she finally decided that she wasn't going to do this anymore, she sought the advice of another doctor who was actually named Mary Jacobi. She was one of the very first female doctors who strongly opposed Mitchell. And she instead gave her a regimen of physical and mental stimulation of activity that actually helped her pull out of this postpartum state. After she wrote the Yellow Wallpaper, which was 5 years after this experience, she wrote it in 1890. She actually sent a copy of it to Mitchell, trying to get him to change, to explain to him what it was like to actually be somebody enduring this 3 months of, solitude and no stimulation and essentially white torture. It didn't work. He continued for another 16 years prescribing the rest cure. In fact, he tried to set up hospitals, entire hospitals, so that women would be like really imprisoned to do this. Virginia Woolf was also prescribed the rest cure. She mentions it in Mrs. Dalloway. There's a little description. So anyway, that's the Yellow Wallpaper. That's where it comes from, and that's why she wrote it. So I remember learning about this. Go ahead.
Yeah, so here's a copy, and Lierre's shown a copy as well. This is a PDF of the Yellow Wallpaper. It's really available, and it's also very short. So there's about 7-10 pages of this, and you can read it. You can also listen to it on Audible. Both of her books and some others are available on Audible. So if you like listening to books, have a look, and you should be able to find it. Now, on the first page, there's this very, very insightful comment that she makes in the Yellow Wallpaper, where she's describing that she's been taken away with, or her husband has said, they should go for the holidays to a big country house, a colonial mansion it's called, and that she should stay much of the time lying on her bed in the old nursery at the top of the house. And that's where this horrible yellow wallpaper is, or this sort of that she becomes very obsessed with. And she's just suffering. So she says in the Yellow Wallpaper, so it's sort of autobiographical. She just had a child. She's suffering severe depression, and she says, she writes about it. She says, John laughs at me, of course, but one expects that in marriage. That's her husband. And then she says, John is practical in the extreme. He has no patience with faith and intense horror of superstition. He scoffs openly at any talk of things not to be felt and seen and put down in figures. Then she goes, John is a physician, and perhaps I would not say it to a living soul, of course, but this is dead paper and a great relief to my mind. Perhaps that is one reason I do not get well faster. And so she sort of nailed it, this insight, and there's a very complicated insight that many women feminists have written a lot about, is that physicians are the cause of lots of our problems, and husbands. And so she puts it so succinctly that she's actually starting to think that her problems are caused by him, and particularly that he's a doctor. And then she goes on to say that her brother is also a physician and is saying there's nothing wrong with her. They're both of high standing, and that the best thing for her to do is stop writing. And then what's so brilliant, it's so well constructed, is there she is writing, and she does a lot of the writing in secret. So as you're reading it, you say, he's coming, he's coming. So I'm going to put away the pencil, I'm going to put away the pen, because we don't want him to know. And then how she says how difficult it is to be writing when she's not meant to, and she's being told that that's the cause of her problems.
Yeah, she says, I sometimes fancy that in my condition, if I had less opposition and more society and stimulus, but John says the very worst thing I can do is to think about my condition, and I confess it always makes me feel bad. So I let it all alone and talk about the house. So she's just a prisoner inside this house, and every attempt she makes to get stimulation, to get just, some kind of mental activity, here's, wonderful John coming in to tell her, oh, you poor dear, put that away. You don't want to be sick, do you? And, cuts her right off at the pass. So she's just completely contained inside this room, which is an old nursery, by the way. It's not just any room. She's literally stuck in this old nursery.
Yeah. And it's so well constructed, this it's a very short essay, sort of novella, that you start off sort of, you can imagine being her, going and being unwell and being in this situation where you're married to a man who doesn't believe you're unwell but thinks you should just stop writing and not meet people. Then his sister's there as well, and she agrees with him. She's complicit with John and her own brother. So she's cut off, and John's sister is looking after her baby. So we're sort of, you can imagine the situation. And Charlotte Perkins Gilman is up in this room, and she starts looking at the wallpaper, and this yellow wallpaper, and she sees it as a sort of layer which starts to become like a prison. And she describes the wallpaper, the sort of patterns on it, and the never-ending sort of variety and the swirling nature of it. She also at the same time says that there's this wallpaper, but she's also in this room which is at the top of the house with only one way out, and there are bars on the windows. So there's a lot of sort of worrying things in the room, like the floor has been sort of scraped out, so there's lots of damage on the floor and on the walls. And people before, she thinks it was a boys' school, but she's a boys' nursery, sort of young boys were using it as a nursery. They've pulled off lots of the wallpaper, so it's sort of a really horrible situation of being trapped, and maybe people before were barred in and trapped. So she starts to build that sort of feeling of being trapped in. And it's brilliantly constructed because of all being an analogy for her life and the trap that women are in patriarchy.
Yeah, and it's this terrible color as well. The pattern doesn't make a lot of sense. Like she says, I have, some art knowledge, some design knowledge, and it doesn't actually repeat. Like the only thing that repeats is the actual big strips of it. The pattern itself kind of makes you crazy when you stare at it, because it doesn't actually end in any kind of geometric way or any kind of, anything that's sort of got pleasing symmetry. It's just kind of insane inside this, sort of mushroom-like sort of little squirrels and stuff. And then it just sort of commits suicide every once in a while and sort of comes to an end. And then the color is also supposed to be really horrifying too, because it's like this sort of sickly yellow. Like the color is described as extremely unpleasant yellow. And also it changes as the light hits it and then recedes. so it's never stable inside. Like the color itself is constantly shifting as well, and it's just unpleasant no matter what color it is at whatever time of day. There's never like a nice color yellow that she's looking at.
I
So the
think,
whole, yeah.
yeah, and I think she asks John if her husband, if they can move into a different room, and he says no, 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 and she says, well, what about redecorating? And he says, no, we're only here for 3 months. So he's sort of denying her feelings and her sort of identification of how she might get better, and just saying, no, 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 I know what's best for you. And she's left there a lot on her own. And there are these really interesting bits of the story where he has to go off to work quite a lot. And then she says, it's actually better when he's not there to some extent. So she's sort of identifying, she just lets that hang, sort of notices that things are better when he's not there. And then she says he works a lot, and sometimes he has to work away all night for his terribly important work. And for me, that's sort of, I just thought, yeah, she just lets it hang there, that her husband is, there's no question that he might have to be away all night. And we think, well, what was he doing? Why was he away all night? And that's just left hanging in, and she doesn't even go into what's going on there. That's just an accepted part of the husband's behavior.
Yeah, and then her every attempt to try to get him to see how much she's suffering, because she is way more conscious of it, that in fact her sanity is starting to slip, but he's always got a reason why, like you said, oh, we can't go downstairs because the room isn't big enough downstairs, and the beds are not in the right place, and really we're way more comfortable up here. And she's like, she's sort of thinking about this beautiful room that's downstairs that opens onto the garden, and how much she'd much rather have that room. And he just says, no, you can't, we can't do it. There's reasons I want to be up here, and that overrides any longing that you might have for the open air and the garden and the freedom and the sort of the life force that's out there that she's very drawn to. He won't let her have it, and he's so patronizing to her throughout the entire book. It's always for her own good. It's, oh no, you poor dear, and he laughs at her. He treats her like a child essentially, and then she just has to kind of accept it, and it just gets more and more frustrating as the story wears on.
And then
so
then she's spending a lot of time in the room looking at the wallpaper, and then she says, I really have discovered something at last. Through watching so much at night, when it changes so, I have finally found out the front pattern does move, and no wonder. The woman behind shakes it. Sometimes I think there are many women behind, and sometimes only one, and she crawls around so fast, and her crawling shakes it all over. So she starts to notice and believe that there's a woman behind the yellow patterns in the wallpaper. And this is, it's sort of partly saying that she's perhaps mad in some way, but then what she's also saying is this analogy for we women are behind these bars, and you could say there's one of us trapped behind the wallpaper, but then it's so nice her saying, sometimes I believe there are a great many women behind it. So you start to see this incredible sort of complex understanding of our situation. And this was in 1892. She writes it in such a complicated and sort of insightful way, and she becomes more and more interested in what's happening to the woman who's trapped behind the wallpaper.
Yeah, and then the whole story just starts to degenerate or pick up the pace anyway from there, because of course the more she sees the woman, then she'll go upstairs to have like her rest, and she's not allowed out of the room. But then she says, oh, it's not so bad anymore because now something exciting is happening, and I need to keep looking for the woman who's trapped inside the wallpaper. And so then she starts to see the woman and perhaps the multitude of women who are creeping around behind the wallpaper. They're never really standing up. They're always sort of on their hands and knees, sort of crawling around back there. And she's not sure whether there's some indication that her husband knows they're there, and also Jenny, the sister. I watched John when he did not know I was looking and come into the room suddenly on the most innocent excuses. And I've caught him several times looking at the paper. And Jenny too. I caught Jenny with her hand on it once. And she tries to ask them about it, but of course they poo-poo her. So she may not be the only one who notices these poor women creeping around behind the wallpaper. Yeah, so, but then, you know, her outward behavior gets more quiet and she's like, oh no, I'm getting so much better. But it's only because she's obsessing now about the, you know, the women who are trapped behind the wallpaper.
And then she decides that because it's coming to the end and they're going of their time in the house, and she decides she wants to try to get the woman out and she's going to go for it. So she's been peeling off a lot of the wallpaper of the bars. And what she does is she gets the key, she locks herself in the room, and she throws the key downstairs so that nobody can get in, and she's going to have quite a good time. She says, I've locked the door and thrown the key down into the front path. I don't want to go out, and I don't want anybody to have anybody come in till John comes. I want to astonish him. I've got a rope up here that even Jenny did not find. If that woman does get out and tries to get away, I can tie her. And then she starts to peel off the wallpaper. And I find it so interesting that you don't know what she's going to do with the rope. You think possibly she might just throw herself out of the window, you know, and hang herself or something with the rope. That's what I thought when I read it. But there's quite a lot of sort of unanswered questions in it. But anyway, she's got this rope. It's becoming real, a material thing that she believes is happening. And she pulls off the wallpaper, and finally the woman gets out. And then as the woman getting out is her, really. Is that how you see it, Lierre?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And then she says, so she sort of merges with the woman, and then she says, here I can creep smoothly on the floor, and my shoulder just fits in that long smooch around the wall, so I cannot lose my way. So she's become the creeping woman. And then she says, why? There's John at the door. And she says, it's no use, you can't open it. And he's trying to get in, he calls for an axe. And she says, no, John, go downstairs. The key, I've thrown the key downstairs. And then he just says, open the door. And she repeats, you have to go down. And he goes down and gets the key. So she's got a little bit more time. And then maybe you say what happens at the end, Lierre.
So he's like, he gets the door open, and then he's like, what's going on? And he's all upset, you know, seeing that she's ripped all the wallpaper off and she's crawling around. And then she says, I've got out at last in spite of you and Jane, and I pulled off most of the paper, so you can't put me back. And then he faints. And then she creeps, she's going to keep making this circuit around and around the room. And she's like, well, I'm just going to have to crawl over him every time. And that's where it ends.
Yeah, and it's so brilliant.
She does declare, you can't put me back.
Yeah, and she goes, now, why should that man have fainted? Well, yeah, but he did, and right across my path by the wall, so I had to creep over him every time. It's so brilliant. It's really, you know, a delightful end that she's, every time she goes around and he's still fainted, it's like that could be the answer. So that's a very nice sort of freedom at the end. There's a bit in this book by Dale Spender, Women of Ideas and What Men Have Done to Them, which is really a fantastic book for everybody interested in radical feminist thought. What she says is that she didn't know, so Dale Spender wrote this in the sort of late 70s, maybe 1980. She didn't know about Charlotte Perkins Gilman because she was covered up. So instead of her being you know, a key text that all schoolgirls should read, or everybody should read growing up, she is one of the she was accepted, and many people think she's one of the foremost intellectuals, political theorists of the decades around the turn of the century, sort of 1900, around then. She came up with so many important ideas. She wrote so much that we should all read her. She wrote a thing, Women in Economics, which is unbelievably brilliant, but she wrote lots of political stuff that's just directly about how politics should be organized. And then she had this fantastic feminist insight, which links up the problems with the medical establishment on problematizing women's lives and our creativity. But Dale Spender writes, my own past floods in on me as I read her accounts of the early days of wedded bliss, and as she plunged herself, this is like Lierre says, when Charlotte Perkins Gilman was married, into the frenzy of domestic activity, only to find that the harder she tried, the worse she felt, and the harder she tried. Having frenetically washed and wiped plates until they gleamed and then smashed them, I know how she felt. I know if I had been able to read Charlotte Perkins Gilman's description and explanation of the state of mind of the new housewife when I was experiencing the first shocks of such an existence, I would have felt reassured rather than irrational. But I did not know she existed at that stage of my life. And, you know, I didn't know about the Yellow Wallpaper until later in my life, but I totally agree that, you know, with Dale Spender, that everybody or all women should know and should read Charlotte Perkins Gilman, this and her other work, and it's so important, such an important insight. And then also that she wrote it such a long time ago, and it was covered up and only uncovered in the 70s and 80s.
We actually read it in high school. So I was probably, I don't know, 15 or 16 when we read it. And it was explained to us all about S. Weir Mitchell and, you know, what he did to women. And it was horrifying. I'm not sure that I quite absorbed the entire feminist message of it, but I quite understood how awful it would be to be locked in a room with no writing and no reading materials. And that, you know, that sort of sense of horror of, you know, how many millions of women this must have been done to, and that this was utterly about male control of women. And then reading the book, and it's just, you know, at that point it made a huge impression, just like the just, you know, it's sort of gothic too. I mean, it's a very disturbing read if you're, you know, still a teenager, and it definitely left an impression. But I didn't go on to explore, like, I don't think I was told, you know, that, oh, she wrote all this other really great stuff that was very political. Like, I didn't know about her political background, but I definitely got the emotional hit from the story at that age as well. And just thinking, my God, what if that had been me? You know, I mean, I had all kinds of intellectual and creative abilities that I wanted to, you know, explore as I was growing. And I just thought, I couldn't imagine anything more hellish than being stuck in a room with no books. Like, and that this is what they were telling women to do, you know, at that time period. It was like, well, no wonder we had the suffrage movement. I mean, it seemed pretty obvious that this was a cry for help. So anyway, they said this was the best selling book from the Women's Press. When they republished it, I think even to this day, it's their most well sold book. So I'm glad that they found it and redid it.
And I think quite a few people who are not feminists or have read it. So I think I didn't get given it to read when I was studying English literature, which I wish I had been. But I think you're right, quite a few have read it. And one of the things that, if you haven't read it, I would really recommend you do, and also look at finding some of the other writings of Charlotte Perkins Gilman, because they're really fun and not necessary. I mean, a lot of them are just quite light, but very, very insightful. So they're sort of like morality tales, but they're beautiful and amusing. And they're from a fantastic feminist perspective. So you feel as if you're listening to or reading with a dear sister who, you know, she is. And it's a wonderful sort of body of writing that you can really enjoy and also learn from and get an insight into that sort of 1900s in a lot of it's sort of the East Coast of America. But I think most of her writing is about the East Coast, isn't it? It's New York and the sort of those New England states, which is, she's just a fantastic writer as well. So that's a really great reason for reading her stuff.
And she also ran a newspaper. It's called the Forerunner. It was like a journal newspaper. So she was just an incredibly prolific, just human being on the planet. Like she did so much stuff because that's a lot of work. And she just was absolutely committed to having a really solid journal for her movement. She was really disgusted by a lot of the other newspapers because she thought they were too sensationalist, and she really wanted people to take it all seriously. So she produced this newspaper. It's called the Forerunner, and some of her own work was serialized in there as well. But she was quite a formidable character, and it's a shame that more women don't know about her as a suffrage, somebody who fought women's suffrage, but really in that whole sort of constellation of concerns that were, very much about radical social change.
And then before we move on to Herland, the great book she wrote, I'll just read you, this is again from the Dale Spender book. The titles of some of her books and articles are clear statements of her values. So these are some of Charlotte Perkins Gilman's books. His Religion and Hers, a study of the faith of our fathers and the work of our mothers. The Home, its work and influence. Human Work, the man-made world, our androcentric culture, and then Women and Economics. Now, one that's not mentioned here that I've just listened to on Audible is The Day I Was a Witch. And it's just, it's like there's all these modern stories about women or girls getting superpowers. And she wrote this really nice short story about the day she was a witch, and she found that, I think she got a black cat and then she got this power. And the power was that anything she thought, wished, happened. And so it's very, very amusing because she wishes a range of things like cars wouldn't make so much noise, and that the men who owned horses in New York would feel the whipping that they did to the horses themselves. And then she says, okay, so, and then it happens. And then, the quality of life for horses went up massively. And then, well, one thing I found really amusing is she says she wishes the priests or the ministers in the churches would tell the truth, say what they were really thinking. And then she describes how every week they had to sack the ministers because they had said all these outrageous things. And she says that almost all the women left the churches because the male ministers were saying what they really thought of women. And a lot more men started going to church. So it's like, and then she did, then at the end of that, she tried to do something good, like she had a good thought, and then it broke everything, and she worked out it was a negative power. But it's very well written, really funny, and you sort of think this is like 100 years ago. It's great. So
should we look that one up? I've never even heard of that one. That sounds really fun.
Yeah, and maybe what I'll do is I'll put in the YouTube, I'll put a list of some of the recommended books at least, and other people could add that. So we could move on now to Herland. So maybe if you Lierre, tell us a bit of an introduction to it all.
So Herland is a utopian fantasy novel about. So the setup is that there's somewhere it sounds like maybe Switzerland, sort of like up in the mountains somewhere. We're not exactly told where. There's this civilization, and the mountain. There's one mountain pass up to it, and it collapsed. So it's filled with rubble, so you can't get there anymore. So they've been all on their own for 2,000 years. But now we have airplanes. So these 3 young men are kind of on an adventure, and they have a little plane. And they hear rumors about this place as they're hiking on up there. And so they get in their little airplane and they decide, well, let's actually go and see if we can find it. And so they do. They go in their airplane and they can see that there's this country that nobody knows about. So they land their little airplane and then they start to have interactions with who lives in this country. And they're told almost immediately that first they have to learn the language, but they're sort of held captive because nobody can quite trust them. And it's a very nice captivity. They're given everything they could need, but until they're taught how to speak the language, obviously not much is going to happen. And the people who run the place all seem to be women. Like there's no men. They don't see any men, but they're given away to. They're taught essentially. They're given like little primers about how to learn, and then they're given instruction on how to speak. So eventually, after a few months, they do become more fluent. And indeed, there are no men in this place. There's only women. And they don't, at first they're like, this is outrageous. This can't be true. But it is true. There are no men in this land. So how did they reproduce for 2,000 years? Like, how did it not just die out? And so there's this wonderful explanation of Parthenogenesis about how they did almost die out, but then finally a daughter was suddenly born who had this miraculous capacity. So they are all descendants of this one woman who somehow figured out how to do parthenogenesis. But the book is really funny. And it's funny because it's basically the Socratic method applied to patriarchy. So there's the three young men who all are sort of a version of patriarchy. There's the narrator is Van, and he has sort of a cooler temperament than the other two. He's more sort of scientifically minded. But his friend Terry is, just sort of your basic caveman approach to women, where he thinks women want to be dominated, and that they will always want to submit to men. You just have to show them that they want to submit. And then his other friend is sort of the woman on a pedestal patriarchy, where he really worships women, and he is very chivalrous, and he wants to protect women. And so the three of them get into these discussions with the women, trying to explain, oh, no, we have things way better where we are. But of course, it's not true. And so every question they ask just shows that patriarchy out here is just for shit. Like, it's just so bad out here. And they are utterly bewildered. Why would you do things this way? We do things this way. And it's just a sort of standard gynocentric matrifocal culture without men at all. So
yeah, I think when I read it, I did read this when I was, say, 18 or something. It changed my life utterly. Yeah. And I recommend anybody who hasn't read it, just read it immediately. Yeah. There's PDFs around, you can read it. It changed my life because it gave a really, really convincing community of women that was beautiful and stunning and believable, and it created Herland inside me. So I believed in women-only culture, and the only time I've ever had that where as sort of lived it is a women only, like when I was young, basically we just hung out in London with loads of women and never really talked to men, and then going to women only camping, so sort of separatist lesbian communities or women only festivals, we have that. But what was really nice about Herland is it was a vision of a community where it was permanent, and it had been going for 2,000 years. So they'd built up a culture that she describes, and it's stunning. I mean, it's just absolutely beautiful, and it rests with you. It really changes you having that. And I feel like all females should have read this, because it's such an important sort of place that we can imagine exists and maybe work towards. So and then it's also a brilliant book, because it brings up lots of questions. Like the men keep on saying, but there's no dirt, and why are there no animals? So they chose to have no animals in the land. They just produce sort of nuts and grains and grow vegetables. And they explained that they realized that they were doing very well with this parthenogenesis, and the population was growing, and they got to about 3 million, and they realized the size of the land was only enough to have those 3 million, and the most efficient way to run it would be without animals. So they thought together, and they made decisions together about how they would live in the future, which is completely alien in patriarchy, where actually being able to think together and make decisions about how life would be. And they also worked out about how to limit the population to a sustainable level. So it's really interesting in terms of sort of ecology and sustainability and the environmental crisis that we're in, where the governments that we've got at the moment seem to be, well, are completely incapable of thinking about how we could live sustainably on the planet. Whereas she had this vision that she wrote in 1930 of a community of women sitting down and planning and thinking and saying, okay, it might not be great for everybody, because not everybody got to have kids, or maybe they just have one child each or something like that.
They figured out how to only have one each, so it was replacement levels. They were absolutely busting through their carrying capacity, and they figured out that if you would get this at age 25 is when they're old enough to start reproducing parthenogenetically. So they get this tremendous feeling that comes over them that's like, where all they can think about is babies, and they know that it's coming. And so when they start to get that feeling, when it starts to come on, they divert their attention to other concerns, so that you throw yourself into your work or to your creative endeavors, and you do all kinds of physical things, like you go out and plant trees or whatever, you get yourself really involved, and that stops the process from happening. So up until that point, all of the daughters and the granddaughters were having 5 children each.
Oh,
and
yeah,
you can see that it would just keep multiplying out, and they realized we are going to be completely busted here. We've got to do something. And so they just figured out that by diverting their attention, they were able to stop the parthenogenetic process. So they were each only allowed to have one. So it's a huge deal when you have your one, because the whole culture is essentially mothers. It's mothers and children. And yeah, no, so they make all these decisions. It was, like you said, it was absolutely life-changing. I also read this when I was sort of in my late teen years. And also, I mean, there's a whole tradition of this kind of feminist utopian novels that you can find. And I don't know how, I mean, I'm 57, I read them all, but I don't know how easy these are to find for young women. But I mean, I found every single one of them that I could. Everybody was reading these books, in the early 80s into the whatever, like when I was sort of being socialized into feminist culture, you found these books everywhere. Because
but are there any that are actually good? Because I
yes.
know,
they're terrible,
the only
but
one
they're great.
that's the Daughters of Agalia by Gerd Brandenburg is about that reversal where women sort of are thrilled with themselves and they're really horrible to men. And that's interesting, but it's not good. This is the only one that I think I've come across. I'd love it if there were other ones that are inspirational and beautiful and create a joyous space. It gives us a vision of a woman's community, what we would do as, and actually related to that is that it's said that Charlotte Perkins Gilman felt that, really truly believed that women were the sort of full humans, and that the inadequate people on the planet were men. And in this book, she sort of shows the failings of our society and the contrast with her vision of what we would do if we had a Herland. And it's very convincing. And it's also really interesting that the way she builds up the Herland is that women are in a community, they're in harmony with the natural surroundings, with the land, they're using the resources sustainably, they're living a really good life, they're very fit, they're very strong, they're very healthy, which she really approved of. But their ultimate sort of objective is being mothers. Now, that's contested within radical feminism. I think that we don't want to say that our main aim is to be mothers. And I don't read it as if she is saying that. I read her sort of vision of what women would do, or the Herland, in a positive way, that we would the sort of motherhood idea that she's talking about is that we're we're thinking about future generations, and we're thinking about the planet, and we're thinking about sisterhood. And really I mean, the sisterhood you see in Herland is fantastic. The sort of the community of thought and the lack of competition. So she has been criticized for being sort of going on about how great motherhood is, but I think that that's disingenuous. And she's also criticized for being into eugenics, this sort of creation of a better society. And again, my reading is that it's interesting. I don't think that Herland is badly, I don't think it's wrong to want to make society good and improve it, but yeah, I don't know about what do you think about that, Lierre, about her ultimate vision?
I think that the best cultures on the planet are those gynocentric matriarchal cultures. I mean, they're peaceful and they're egalitarian, and the values that are in those cultures are just in complete opposition to what's wrecking the planet. And it is about caring about the future of, into the 7th generation. You're supposed to think ahead that far. And it is about putting the mother-child unit at the center. That doesn't mean that every single one of us has to be a mother, but it's only having that kind of a culture that's going to produce the society that we all want, where that bond is absolutely central to our species, because we're not just a social species, we're a super social species. We are so dependent for so long, and we're really unique in that. There's no other animal that doesn't reach maturity until so long. We're born premature because we've got these giant brains. We wouldn't be able to exit if our brains were actually, where they should be. So they always talk about, the 4th trimester, that first few months when babies are just supposed to sleep and eat and do not much else, because their brains are developing so fast. They have to get, to full adult size. Anyway, the only way that humans have survived until now is that, we're supposed to live in these really tight-knit small communities, these little tribes, because it's so labor intensive to raise our young. And that mother-child bond is really primary. And in any culture that's worth living in, that is the primary bond. It's not like the romantic bonds between men and women. That's patriarchy. It's completely supplanted our actual, biological needs as a species that has dependent young for so long.
And I think, I mean, there's some really nice bits in the book where the guys, these 3 men, go in and they're sort of talking, they get to know some of the women, and they're talking about motherhood in our society, in capitalism and patriarchy, and how sex works, how men and women live together in a home and they're always together. So it's basically like pretty much a prison. Well, it is. And the women of Herland are really horrified, and they say, no way, we're not going to live with you. We're not living in a room with you in a home. You can have your own houses, and we might come and meet you from time to time. And then because they pair up in the end, and because the women of Herland are thinking maybe, because they're thinking maybe it would be good to have men around. Maybe they can help because of this genetic diversity, that it might be a good thing, and they might be able to do fatherhood might be they might be good at that, like, surely. And they're sort of, they keep asking the men, what is it, what's so, I mean, it must be amazing that your societies, because you've got men and women, isn't that great? And the men are really embarrassed because they have to reveal how appalling it is. And there's some really good bits about, they only basically think that they would have sex with the men once, and if they're going to have a child, and none of the rest of it would happen, which sort of fits in with, say, the Sheila Jeffreys spinster and her enemies, the questioning of and the right for women not to have sex with men, and that these women in Herland, she articulates very clearly that they just think the whole thing is complete nonsense, and they sort of ask about it. What on earth do you mean that love, and that women want to live just at home in a house with a man? Surely that's completely mad. So it's really inspiring that she has thought all this through and articulates it so clearly in
And
1930.
it's very I mean, it's incredibly radical. And to think that she wrote this in like 1920, you know, I mean, it could have been written today. It's like just an absolutely sort of prescient laying out of, you know, all of the theory that we have now. She already had it all there. You know, it's already in this book. In the book, she has this, like the reason that the women don't want to have sex is they sort of, since they don't need it anymore, there's no sex drive to reproduce, since they can do it parthenogenically. It's like over the centuries, there's sort of less and less sexual desire. So by the time these men arrive, they just don't really have any sexual desire. And that, I remember when I first read this, I was like, that's interesting that she didn't go kind of in the lesbian direction where they would, you know, pair up and be lovers with each other, or, you know, some kind of arrangement like that. Instead, it's like, well, women just don't have much desire in this world because they don't need it. So it's sort of, you know, evolution has sort of taken care of this. There's no drive because it's not necessary to find a mate. So it's not there. And I just remember sort of wondering about that when I first read it, like, I wonder if she would now, whether she would write a book that was more, you know, where there were lesbian couples instead of, oh, well, no sexual desire at all. But her critique of heterosexuality is absolutely spot on. And so toward the end of the book, when they all pair up, the one guy, Terry, who's sort of the caveman model, he comes to great disgrace because he essentially tries to rape the woman that he marries, and she's not having it. And of course, all the other women jump in and pull him down, and they tie him up and they cart him off they sort of keep him in a prison, and then they have a trial, which is something they've never done before. They haven't had anybody break the law in hundreds of years, and they're not really sure what to do. So they have a big trial where they, you know, try to figure out, well, what are we going to do with him? And then they decide we just have to expel him. He's not ever going to be safe here. And so at the end of the book, they leave. Van, the man who's writing the book, leaves with, and he takes his wife, that she wants to go. She wants to see the world. So they leave and they take him back. And there is a sequel to this book that's called With Her in Our Land, where now they're in the modern world, full patriarchy. And so you see it through her eyes. It's not as good as Herland. I didn't like it as much when I read it. This book is the one that really stands out to me. But it's, you know, obviously you want to read the sequel if you've read the first one. I just have a couple of little anecdotes. One is that I had a friend years ago who was just coming into being a feminist, and she was at that stage where she wanted to argue with men all the time. And so she would go to work, and there was this one guy who clearly loved arguing with her. And her point was always, men are better than women. And his point was, are you crazy? Women are ridiculous. Of course, men are better. And the time that she finally got him, she said, okay, I'm going to divide the world in half. And all the men are going to live on one side, and all the women are going to live on the other side. Which half do you want to be on? And he was completely flabbergasted. He was like, all right, I see your point. Because of course, on the women's side, what's there going to be? Houses, food, people who take care of you when you're sick. Everyone's basically going to be nice to you, right? And then you're looking at the men's side, and you know it's just going to be a rape hierarchy. And he saw that. And so that was it. She won the ultimate debate. And that's Herland. I mean, that's exactly what's in this book, is explaining how women would do things differently. But as for other books, that this really sets the tradition on its course. I would highly recommend, if you haven't read them, these were sort of classics of the second wave. If you were part of feminist culture, you would have read these books at the time. One is The Wanderground by Sally Miller Gearhart. And it's a sort of speculative fiction, as they say now. This thing has happened called the revolt of the earth. And so unless men are living together in a city, the machines don't work anymore, and animals don't listen to men anymore. So men are stuck living in groups, in big groups inside cities. They can't leave to the countryside. Oh, also they're impotent if they leave the cities. So they're all inside the cities. And the women have escaped to the outside of the city. So these women are living in this other kind of completely different culture that they've created as they've escaped one by one from the hell that men have made. And that's what the book is about, is what the women are doing outside the cities. And there's this thing you have to do where they've realized they have to rotate back into the cities on occasion. If they don't keep this great balance, then it all falls apart and it'll go back to being terrible patriarchy everywhere. So they have to flip back in. So they're on rotation back in sometimes, and they have horrible experiences when they have to interact with men again. But this book was, I mean, everybody read it in, whatever, 1980, 1984, 85. It was like this, you had to read it. And it was so inspiring. Like, oh, and in this book, they're lesbians. They are lovers when they're outside. So it's, sort of a modern retelling of this whole thing. But there was this very, I mean, this is kind of a weird story, but I went, my girlfriend and I drove cross country. It was, I don't know, 1990. And I had never been to the Rocky Mountains, which is, the huge mountain range that splits North America. And there's a spot called the Great Divide, which is the absolute top of the mountains. From that point, every river either flows to the Pacific or to the Atlantic, depending on which side of the divide you fall on. Nobody really knows why. It's just sort of one of those, and there's animals and plants that only live on one side and not the other. You can walk across. I mean, it's not like a huge chasm. It just looks exactly the same as you're driving over. But there's plants and animals that don't cross the Great Divide. We don't know why. It's a little bit weird, right? So it's 5 o'clock in the morning. We pull up into this parking lot to be at, there's a sign. This is the Great Divide, and you can stand there half and half, right? So you have to do it. So we pull over into this little parking lot, and it's literally 5 o'clock in the morning. And out of nowhere, another car comes and pulls up into the same parking lot. And we all get out of our cars at the same time. And damn, it's a lesbian couple. So there's 2 of them. And there's me and Dorian. We all get out of our cars and we just stare at each other because they're going this way and we're going that way. And there's like this one big thought bubble over all 4 of us, the wander ground. It's like, we have to keep the balance. 2 of us are going this way. 2 of us have to go that way, or else it all falls to shit. It was this, I have no explanation for this experience. It was just utterly bizarre. And we were all thinking the same thing. We're like, hi, oh, good morning. I guess we're keeping the balance here. It was so funny. Anyway, read that one. And then the other one I highly recommend is Sherry Tepper's book, The Gate to Women's Country. And that book is exact opposite. The women live in the cities and the men live outside in the countryside. And there's an entire other plot going on that Sherry Tepper always has a twist. I'm not giving it away, but you have to read it to see what she's doing with this book. And all of her work is fantastic. She's very, very feminist. And there's a lot of other good books I would recommend that she wrote. Shadow's End especially is my favorite, but there's a lot of great radical feminist stuff in her books as well. But there's, again, this whole tradition of utopian fiction that women have taken up, pretty seriously, because it's one way to get from here to freedom. You have to be able to imagine it. You have to be able to imagine that there's another world. And I just remember so many times explaining to women who were not in my world what it was like to go to, things like Mishfest or the other women's festivals. Like, there is an entire world out here that women have created from scratch. You have to understand, women are the carpenters. They are, we own bookstores. You can just spend your entire life inside this women's culture, and women are at the center of it. Like, we don't care what men are doing. This is our world. We love each other. We support each other. And it just would blow their minds.
I think, and I think by reading about it, it becomes a possibility. And it just reminds me also of her discussion about femininity in Herland. So the men are saying, oh, these are not feminine women, and they're the first time they meet the women, they're over 40, and they're saying, oh, we wanted to just meet the girls because they're totally different. And then she describes how the men are thinking about what women should be, and this contrast, this vision of women who have short hair, they're not performing femininity, is really it's just very inspiring. But it's a very easy way and a good way to get it to sort of understand a lot of radical feminist theory. And as we've mentioned, the sort of lack of lesbianism in there is interesting, and it's sort of like typical of the early 20th century, but the 19th century, that women often didn't talk about lesbianism in their writing and try to avoid that issue. And but she does mention violence against women, which is interesting, isn't it? That's often not talked about as well. So that, well, look, we've come to 11 in UK. We've done an hour, so we're going to come to the end of this webinar. I'll get from the chat any of the good book recommendations, and I'll put them on the YouTube underneath. So, and also what you've just said, Lierre, I'll get the names of those books. So, and if anybody can think of anything else, go onto the YouTube and put other books that we could read, because that could be really useful for the summer holidays. We have lots to read. Have you got anything else to add, Lierre, before we finish?
Oh, I just all these utopian and the real experiments that women did, you know, in real time. I mean, a lot of it was inspired by these kinds of books that, you know, we could dream it, we could try to make it happen. And I just think that this kind of literature is incredibly important to inspire us and to just charge up our imaginations about what is possible, because, you know, it's pretty grim out there. And I think it really helps to have a vision of what life could be. And yeah.
So it might be my video, but that I couldn't hear that. But anyway, it might be my fault. It might be my bad internet, but whatever, we'll put it, we'll finish now. Thank you so much, Lierre. It's been a real pleasure. It's great, and it looks, I'll read the chat later, but it looks like women have really enjoyed this. Next week, we have got Sheila Jeffries talking with Laura Lacona about Sheila Jeffries' book, Anti-Climax. So same time, and have a nice week, everybody. See you soon. Bye.